Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Leo Tolstoy is understandably one of the Russian authors that Leo Shestov engages with, if not the most, certainly up there. Perhaps Dostoevsky gets engaged more than Tolstoy does. And Shestov, in fact, has books comparing both of them with Nietzsche on important matters. But in All Things Are Possible, he talks a lot about Tolstoy. And he says things that are complimentary but kind of backhanded compliments. I want to begin with his remark in part 1, chapter 111, where he's saying about a number of different writers. He's talking about Dostoevsky, who looks like a gaping simpleton in his Injured and Insulted and Poor Folk, but in Letters from the Underground, he's the shrewdest and cleverest of writers. And he says, well, we can say the same thing of Nietzsche, Tolstoy, or Shakespeare. And then he'll tell us about those. And he says the best instance of all those is Tolstoy, right up to today. Whenever he likes, he can be cleverer than the cleverest. At other times, he is a schoolboy, meaning he's naive, he's foolish, right? He doesn't have much experience, even as an old man. And then Shestov says, this is the most interesting and enviable trait in him. So the most interesting trait, this divergence between being really thoughtful and sophisticated and being stupid and naive, but it's also an enviable trait. And we should think about, well, what is there to envy about that? Well, the full range of human experience, perhaps. So backtracking a little bit into the work, in section 96 of the first part, he tells us about Tolstoy effectively putting a choice to poets, a sort of utilitarian choice. Either be virtuous or stop creating and forfeit the fame of teachers, one way or the other. Right? And we can think of him like talking to Pushkin, for example. Quit the womanizing. You got to be a good boy or else shut the hell up. And fortunately, as we read, if Tolstoy did not make a laughing stock of himself, why? He can thank his gray hairs and the respect which was felt for his past. Nobody took him seriously. Far from it. Never did poets feel so free from the shackles of morality as they do now. And then he's got a really interesting remark here. In Tolstoy himself, it's not so much his virtues as his vices which we find interesting. We begin to understand his works, not so much in the light of his striving after ideals, but the standpoint of the incongruity which existed between the ideas he artificially imposed upon himself and the demands of his own non-virtuous soul, which struggled forever in liberty, right? And so he's kind of like his messed up characters. And he goes on a little bit later and he says, how can the morality of Tolstoy's heroes be trusted? Consciousness of one's ugliness begets shyness. Shyness drives the passions inward and allows them no natural outlet. Little by little, there develops a monstrous discrepancy between the imagination and its desires on the one hand, and the power to satisfy these desires on another. And then he brings up one of Tolstoy's darkest works, a play which only has been put on a few times, called Power of Darkness. He says, in our day, no one has scourged love so cruelly as Tolstoy in Power of Darkness. And I think relatively few people are even familiar with this. Now, coming back to a little bit earlier in the work in chapter 25, we're going to learn about Tolstoy himself as being, kind of a bad guy in some respects. It says the physiognomist Topir would say of Tolstoy, as he said of Socrates, many evil propensities lurking in them. And Tolstoy would say, yeah, man, you're not telling me anything I don't already know. I write entire letters and works about the things that I know are wrong with me. He says, Tolstoy has told us how wicked he found his own nature, how he had to struggle with it. He's not naturally overcourageous. By long effort, he's trained himself to be bold. How afraid of death he was in his youth. How cleverly he could conceal that fear. Later in mature age, it was still the fear of death which inspired him to write his confession. He was conquering that fear, and with that, all other fears. For he felt that, since fear is very difficult to master, man must be a higher being when he's learned not to be afraid anymore. Meanwhile, who knows? Perhaps cowardice, this much abused weakness of the world, is not such a vice. After all, maybe it's even a virtue. Tolstoy could be going wrong in overcoming his fears and faults and failings, right? And so he says, if it were our custom nowadays to express ourselves mythologically, we might hear Tolstoy telling us about his daimon, like Socrates, or his dreams. Instead, he squares his accounts with science and morality in place of gods or demons. Many a present-day Alcibiades, who washes in the week in the muddy waters of life, comes on Sundays to cleanse himself in the pure stream of Tolstoyan ideas, right? So it's a very interesting section. He also talks about, and we've referenced this in the discussion of Turgenev, this conflict between Tolstoy and Turgenev. Tolstoy and Dostoevsky are both representing a kind of European, or they're both representing a Russian as opposed to European attitude about things. And so they don't like Turgenev. And Tolstoy's German biographer isn't happy about the fact that there were misunderstandings and quarrels between Tolstoy and Turgenev, two major literary figures at the same time. And Shestov says, what do you expect? These people are living out diametrically opposed ideas about how a Russian ought to understand their circumstances, the world they live in, how one ought to live, how things should be done or organized. Of course, they're not going to be on the same page and, having some nice, peaceful correspondence. It's interesting at the end of this that he mentions that Dostoevsky was himself within a hair's breadth of a quarrel with Tolstoy, with whom, not long before death interrupted him, he began a long controversy concerning Anna Karenina. Even Tolstoy seemed to him too compliant, too accommodating, right? Too middle of the road. And then we get, in the next chapter, a really interesting discussion about virtues in a broad sense, right? Virtues and inconsistencies. So he says that we rarely make a display of that which is dear to us, near and dear and necessary. But we readily exhibit that which is of no importance to us. So with our virtues, every time we notice in ourselves some quality we don't prize, we make a show of it, thinking perhaps someone would be glad of it. If it wins us approval, we're pleased. So there's some gain, right? And people like writers do this with the public. And he goes on and he says, he's going to talk about, Pushkin and Turgenev, but he's also going to end up talking a little bit about Tolstoy. So he says, Tolstoy believed and then disbelieved according to the work he had in hand. So he's adopting very different attitudes depending on who the attitudes are towards. When it's towards other people, he says, when he had other people's ideas to destroy, he doubted the identity of egoistic and idealistic aspirations. You're either an egoist and you're really like looking out for yourself, or you're an idealist and you think there's something more important, bigger than you. When he had his own ideas to defend, he believed in this. Now, once again, notice what Shestov is going to say. This is a line of conduct worthy of attention and supremely worthy of imitation. We go back to this remark, right, that, Tolstoy's trait is not just interesting, but enviable. Now here it's something that is emulatable on our part, this inconsistency that he shows that he wouldn't be happy about being called to attention. A little bit later in 99, we're going to get another interesting observation, and this is actually quite good. So I'll actually begin at the beginning. Kant, and after him Schopenhauer, was fond of the epithet disinterested and used it on every occasion when the supply of laudatory terms was exhausted. Right? If he had been among Russian peasants, he would have had to have changed his opinion. With them, thoughts about destiny and the why and wherefore of the universe and infinity would by no means be considered disinterested, particularly if the man who devoted himself to such thoughts were at the same time to announce, as becomes a philosopher, that he claimed complete freedom from physical labor. Why? Well, intellectuals get to do that sort of thing, and then non-intellectuals get to say, what the hell is that good for? What are you actually getting out of that? You're going to speculate about freedom and the universe. How does that actually put any bread on the table? Or what else are you going to get? I remember actually when I was first studying philosophy and then going to graduate school, my tradespeople, cousins and uncles asking me, what exactly is your product? What are people going to pay you for? How does that do anything for other people? And so that's exactly what he's talking about here. He tells us they're the philosopher among the Russian peasants, where even Plato would be stigmatized with the disgraceful nickname Idle Jack. The highest activity for them is interested activity, directed towards strictly practical purposes. And if the peasants could speak learnedly, they would call the principle upon which their judgment is founded an a priori. Then he says Tolstoy, who draws his wisdom from the folk sources, attacks the learned for the very fact that they don't want to work but are disinterestedly occupied in the search for truth. So the search for truth or for beauty for its own sake, for example, in what is art, versus what's interested activity for practical purposes. How are you making humanity's lot in life any better with what you're doing? Or how are you even making your own lot in life or those who you're responsible for better? These are, for Tolstoy, important questions. Finally, we have a longer discussion that's taking place in part 2 in chapter 44. And he says that there's a lot of discussions here. He's talking about how people will sometimes espouse strange positions, right? And he says Tolstoy is not really taken quite seriously anymore, although he's still accounted a great man. Now, what's going on? So he's got this really interesting observation. Tolstoy insists on thinking about things that are nobody's concern. He's long since abandoned this world, and does he continue to exist in any other? He writes books and letters, so therefore he exists, right? And Shestov says, this inference, once so convincing, has hardly any effect on us, and especially if we take into account what it is that Tolstoy writes towards the end of his life. He says, in several of his last letters, he expresses, here we get another great phrase, opinions without meaning for the ordinary man. stuff that people would read and be like, what the hell is this? Why are you interested in these issues? What are they? He says, Tolstoy professes an extreme egoism, solipsism, solus ipsaism, right? So like a solipsism that is taken to yet a higher level. So solipsism is the view that only you, the thinking subject or knowing subject, are truly real, and everybody else are kind of like figments of your imagination. And it's not a real philosophical position that most people take seriously, but, Tolstoy did. And he goes on and says, in his old age, after infinite attempts to love his neighbor, he comes to the conclusion not only is it impossible to love one's neighbor, but there is no neighbor, that there is even no world, but only Tolstoy. And Shestov says, this is a view so obviously absurd, it's not worth refuting. And there's no possibility of refuting it unless you admit that logical inferences are non-binding. He says, solipsism dogged Tolstoy in early youth, but he didn't know what to do with the idea, so he ignored it. And as he got older, he figured out what to do with the idea. Here's another goofy idea that he had, that of Christ in the Gospels, basically teaching us common sense. He says, Christ taught men not to do stupid things, and Shestov says, who but Tolstoy could have ventured on such an interpretation of the Gospels? Why have we all held, all of us but Tolstoy, that these words contain the greatest blasphemy on Christ and his teaching? And he says, this is Tolstoy's last desperate attempt to save himself from solipsism without at the same time flying in the face of logic, So he says, this shows us that mad thoughts can be rejected with an easy conscience, and the advantage remains with the wholesome, reasonable, sensible thoughts. There's room for good and for reason. Good is self-understood. It need not be explained. If only good had existed in the world, there would exist no questions, neither simple nor ultimate. And he says the proper questions only arise on contact with evil, And then once questions are started, it's impossible and unseemly to hurry the answers, still less to anticipate the questions. And then there's a long thing in here about Anatole France, and then eventually he comes back to talking about solipsism and the cult of groundlessness, and he tells us that, Tolstoy thinks that nature does not punish us, but educates us. Death and sufferings like animated scarecrows boo at man and drive him into the one way of life open to him. For life is subject to its own law of reason. He's quoting Tolstoy here. And Shestov says, not a bad method of upbringing. Exactly like using wolves and bears, which will eat us, right? Unfortunate man, bolting from one monster, is not always able in time to dodge into the one correct way and dashes straight into the maw of another beast of prey. Then what? This often happens. And so, Tolstoy's attempts to explain things kind of fall flat. And Shestov isn't interested in Tolstoy as a thinker who gives us the ultimate answers to things. He's interested in Tolstoy as somebody who gets things partly right and partly wrong, not just with the sort of verbal formulations, but with these weird inconsistencies that he says at the same time are interesting, enviable, and even worthy of emulating by way of example.